I think what we'll see in the future is like more like narrow social networks where they're like smaller and like for a more specific purpose. And I think that'll lead to like overall just more happiness within a social network.
But the thing which I'm really interested in, or like really bullish on, or like building on, is owning your own identity. And that's a big part of what we're building with Console. If we don't have ownership of the central hub of it, there's less to hack. And so that's essentially where we aim to get. And that's what we're working towards.
Hello everyone, this is Meina, your crypto friend. Today, I have invited Chris Castig, co-founder of Console.xyz, and Dr. Michael Fisher, the founder of CurateDao, to join my podcast. Console.xyz is a secure chat for Web3, while CurateDao is Pinterest for the blockchain. The following is our deep conversation on social media for Web3. We explore the definition, functionality, and philosophical meaning of social media for Web3. What additional values should social media bring to the users in Web3? The following content does not contain any financial advice. Thank you guys for joining my podcast today, Chris and Michael. So, do you want to say hello to my audience?
Hey everybody, nice to meet you.
And before we kick off the interview, can you, each of you, provide a brief introduction to yourself as well as the project that you have been working on?
Hey, my name is Chris Castig. I'm on Twitter at Castig. Little plug, but you can learn more about me there, where you'll find that I am working on a project called Console. Console is Web3 chat. It's an alternative to Discord. And I'm excited to chat more about it today. So,
great. How about you, Michael?
Hey everyone, my name is Michael. I recently, give you some background, I recently finished my PhD. I was studying computer science. I was at Stanford, studying like natural language processing and how to democratize programming. So the idea is like, similar to how DALL-E converts between natural language and images, the idea behind us was like, we wanted to make it so that you could tell the computer what you wanted, and then it would convert it into code. Before that, I was at Stanford also doing my bachelor's in computer science. And then after I graduated, I wrote a book on the intersection of AI and law. It's called Regulating AI. It's based on a course that I was the head teaching assistant for at Stanford Law School, which was taught by a California Supreme Court justice on regulating AI. Wow. And you can follow me on Twitter also at 0xMikeEF. And then my project that we're going to be talking about today is called CurateDao, which is like Pinterest on the blockchain, but you earn money when you use it. And it's supported by our new product that we created, which is like a new style of database, which incentivizes people to create data.
Yeah, definitely. I will include the link to purchase your book into the
description. Pick up a copy of my book. Thanks.
Yeah, and also, Chris, if you have any course that you want to sell, we can also include that link into the description, or maybe a direct link to the Columbia University registration for the business school. Now, before we dive into the social media for Web3's thing, which is definitely what you guys are focusing on building on, let's first talk about what actually is Web3, because I think for the general or the average audience, a lot of them, they don't understand the concept. And because you guys have such a strong academic or educational background, I want to maybe you guys to use one or two sentences to educate users. What is Web3?
Sure. Let me go first. Web3 is really, it's a term that's evolving, right? But to me, it's three really important things. It really stands for these three principles. To me, it's decentralization. It's just basically owning data, owning your own identity, especially ownership. And third is it's about working in public and sharing, transparently, whether it's on the blockchain or through open source code. So to me, decentralization, shared ownership, and this ability to work in public are three principles that really inspire me about Web3. I'd be curious like I said, it's always evolving. So it's possible Mike has his own take on
I agree. I guess to me also it's like around like developing new sets of protocols. So Web 2 was very much built around like server client, server mobile architecture, and centralized databases. And now there's been this new like technological innovation, sort of somewhat recently, called like the blockchain, which has been enabled primarily with cryptography. And based on that sort of like new architecture, we're coming up with like a new set of protocols that are defined based on this like new way of building applications. And one of them, I mean, obviously like a big one is payments. So Web3 is very much around incentives. I mean, like what Chris talked about, centralized, like working in public and decentralization and ownership. I think another interesting one is around like the change in the inclusion of incentives and the inclusion of money as a base primitive in how these new types of applications are going to work. And, if you look at like some of the earlier standards around HTTP and stuff like that, one of the most common protocols is it didn't have the ethos around money. So like, if you look at there actually was included some money protocols in there. Like if you look at like the error codes that exist, like 400 is like bad request, and 401 is unauthorized, and 403 is forbidden, and 404 is like page not found. But actually there's one called 402, which is like payment required. So they did have this sort of forethought that like money and incentives and like paying for things should be required, but it didn't go in. They didn't really have I don't think they had the technology around this, like the concept of a decentralized database that would a decentralized commonly owned currency that would sort of enable it. You could pay with a credit card, but it just for whatever reason took off. And I think that's another big thing. In addition to what Chris mentioned is like how you change incentives and how you pay for things.
Yeah, thank you so much for digging into the actual error codes for the HTTP's protocols. And I think this is definitely a very good additional piece of information for the average users. And to conclude, what you guys said is it's definitely more about the ownership, right? The users can own the data, they can own the services, they can own all the information they are generating on the website or through different applications. And we are trying to help the users to monetizing a lot of those actions, no matter it's like on the blockchain or off the blockchain.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like when you talk about like monetizing, it's also talking about incentives. So like monetizing is like a form of incentive. And so I think with Web3, you have a bit more autonomy and agency over how you choose what's your optimization or what you're trying to incentivize, and figuring out, what are the emergent behaviors that come from that sort of optimization. And I think in Web3, we have the ability to choose these new types of, incentives that we're going to be opting into, because these incentives are oftentimes baked into the crypto protocols. So a crypto protocol is in many ways a shared social construct in how users are going to interact with each other and how a web service is going to interact with it.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, just to kind of like volleyball back and forth, because I don't usually get the chance to kind of go so deep onto some of this stuff, but I do think it's important. So I mean, just to kind of, I guess, frame the way I was thinking about it, and I'd be curious, you can, tell me how my thinking is on this. But when you say protocols, I think that like kind of falls dead on a lot of people's ears sometimes who are like newbies to this, right? But it's true, right? It's so true. So I guess the way I think about it is like that first principle of decentralization. To me, like really, if you think about decentralization as like a principle, basically what we're talking about is Web 2, some people are like, what is Web 2? Web 2, whatever we call Web 2, that's this kind of like basket category of companies like Facebook or Google, basically any internet company, right? And it's very centralized, meaning like it's a platform, really. It's like they own the platform. So when, Michael, when you're talking about protocols, I guess, just correct me if I'm wrong, but like, I think a big part of that is like moving away from platforms and towards what we call protocols. And like, what's a protocol? Again, I think it's really hard to define, but I would love any advice, or maybe we could play with it. But I think the way I think about a protocol is it's basically like decentralized, like blood. I don't know, for like a website. Like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like, I mean, first you gave an example, right? Like there's protocols we use every day, like HTTP. is a protocol we use all the time. You type it to go to any web page, HTTP. People don't even think about it, HTTP. But no one owns HTTP, right? Like it just exists. It really does. Like we all own it and no one owns it. And that's the phenomenon of like, how do we bring that kind of phenomenon of like the internet, like one person can shut it down. We all own it, but nobody owns it. So it's like, how do we bring that power to image sharing, to like home sharing? Like instead of having Airbnb and Instagram, how do we bring those? And that to me is like, I'm just brainstorming, like that's what a protocol is. It's like that bringing that shared ownership and decentralization.
Yeah, it's a common social construct, I think, which people choose to opt into. And like, you could start your own TCP/IP, DNS server, many of these other things. But there's value in opting into one that many other people are using. And the thing is, if that stops providing value, or if someone comes up with a new one, there's also there's allows for people to create new protocols when there's something better out.
I want to chime in a bit. I think if we just look purely at the definition or what's the meaning of a protocol, it's a set of rules that people created, right? And here, what we always talk about in Web3 is we are democratizing something, we are monetizing something. So we are providing the users the ability as well as the option for democratizing a lot of process on the internet. So maybe it's just a group of dreamers gathered together and try to set up a set of rules which can be used, adopted by the general users, right? So we are all the founders or the creators for those set of rules.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for discussing so deeply on the definitions of different terms. Now let's talk about what is social media for Web3. I want to talk about it from two perspectives. One, of course, is the functionality or the technical perspective, right? What are the actual like value add-ons for the users? But secondly, like philosophically, what does this mean for Web3 users? What are the actual different meaning, right, between Web2 and Web3 social media?
I would say the ethos, we're still figuring it out what Web3 social media is going to look like. But I think I would relate it back to this thing that we were talking about before with different incentive mechanisms, and one of the incentive mechanisms being money. But another incentive mechanism that I think we're seeing in Web2 social media is basically like dopamine-driven page views. And I think one of the things that we're going to see in Web3 is like a more longer-term horizon in how we optimize which people will engage with it. So instead of trying to, force one more click on a person, it'll be Web3 social media will be more about like long-term growth and long-term health than we've seen in sort of like the Web2 stuff. And of course, this is going to be powered by advances in technology. But I think sort of at the high level, that's one of the things that people are becoming disenchanted with around Web2 social media. And one of the things that I would suspect there might be like this underlying desire for, you have a goal to learn a new language, to get healthier, to learn how to program, to travel more, to develop deeper relationships with other people. And a lot of like social media apps that we see today aren't really fulfilling that need for people. Whereas some of the newer ones like Strava are helping people to sort of achieve goals that they're in. We can talk more about it, but I'll let Chris talk.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't have too many like kind of big thoughts on social media. My initial reaction is that I feel like whatever Web3 social media will be, we won't use that word. I think that word feels very just like legacy in a bit. And I think it will be something new. And I don't know what it is. But the thing which I'm really interested in, or like really bullish on, or like building on, is owning your own identity. And that's a big part of what we're building with Console. But we're also just using existing identity contracts. So for example, like ENS, is like a .eth name, right? If you have that, there's a certifiable ownership over that name, right? I'm Castig.eth, And it's the same as if I were to own like Instagram.com. It's like a domain name for my identity. And I think that's a really important part of social media today, is that it's really centered around people and it's centered around connections with people. The only thing is like those connections are like in a walled garden is like the term that often gets used in academia. They're like walled into like Facebook. They're walled into whatever, the different sites. And so opening those up, is really the dream. And if you go back to like the beginning of the way Zuckerberg talked about Facebook, like originally he took a lot of those promises or ideals of like, it was called the open graph was the name for the social graph of Facebook. And it was all about like openness and APIs. And like, that was where it started. And where we are today is it actually, that never really happened. So it's fairly closed still within Facebook's world. So I think to me, identity is like the first place that I would look for where social interaction, social conversation, social validation happens. I just don't know that it'll be called social media, but that's just my take.
I see. I guess to summarize what you guys said, like first, Michael, you talk about the different types of users on the internet, right? Maybe some users are very dopamine driven. They want very exciting or entertainment stuff. Some people, they like educational or philosophical contents, while Chris, you brought up the concept about the on-chain identity, which I definitely want us to have some more discussion around that, because I totally agree that this will be a potential exponential growth area for Web3 in the future, because I think even in Web2 world, people, they are trying to form kind of an identity on the internet. And in Web3, I don't know what the platform or which, I guess, channel we're talking about. It could be a metaverse, right? It could be a platform. It could be a protocol. But still, I guess universally, different people will have an on-chain identity on the blockchain. And how that going to be formed along the time by the helps, that is worth discussing.
One other thing I think might be different around Web 2 and Web 3 is I think we're seeing a lot of people like having these like giant social networks that are like billions of people. And I don't think that that's probably the way forward, because the problem with having like so many people on one social network is that it leads to like a couple of things. Like it leads to like it leads to non-specificity. So like it's just open to everything, and like that's not good. It also leads to I think a lot of like negative interactions people have that don't necessarily need to happen. And what I mean by that is there's like this quote that says like strong fences make good neighbors. And what that means is like everything that you do doesn't necessarily you don't need to comment on what everyone else is doing, because that just creates like a lot of friction. And I think what we'll see in the future is like more like narrow social networks where they're like smaller and like for a more specific purpose. And I think that'll lead to like overall just more happiness within a social network, because the problem is like if you look at how many interactions occur, if you have to get like approval of the other like 3 billion people on the network, it just creates all this friction. And I think if you have like smaller things in the orders of like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions, I think you'll have probably like higher quality content and people with like more of a purpose for why they're there.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%. And I would say that's probably what we're seeing with like these NFT communities or DAOs. I would say people feel more, identity is the first step in being part of like like the word social network, like a network of people socializing. But I think the thing that we found in Web 2 is that, okay, you like somebody, your identity is like attached to somebody, but there's not a lot of like incentive to like kind of share value back and forth. It's generally one way. It's like if you follow someone who's famous or whatever, they may have thousands and thousands or millions of like followers, but there's not like, and I think it becomes a weak connection. And I would say that's like what I think Michael's hitting at. There's this opportunity to feel more like meaningful interactions. And I think that comes from having communities where there's objectives, like alignment, like a mission, like some reason that you're there. And I think that is, I think it's really exciting to like, I think of it as like a swarm of bees, and you're like, we're all gonna make honey, or we're all gonna dance. And it's like, you can kind of like organize people now in like a really coordinated swarm. Whereas last time it felt like, okay, we're just like, oh, who's in charge?
So the only coordination mechanism that exists today is basically like the terms of service and the enforcement of the terms of service on many of these websites. So like Facebook or Twitter, their coordination mechanism exists within like the auspices of whatever's laid out in the terms of service, which is basically like anything besides like some certain types of content around like hate and but I think we could actually like look at terms of service as being a good thing or a bad thing. But one way of looking at tightening a social network would be to like increase the terms of service that are there. So it's saying like the goal of this website or the goal of this social network is for this is a very narrow and specific thing. So like obviously like you don't have some certain types of content, but then you also like use that terms of service to like restrict the amount of content there, which leads to like a narrowing of the social network, and also probably a limiting of the people who are on that social network. And that will sort of achieve this goal of like having more of a refined purpose and not as many people engaging about random stuff, and higher quality content and higher quality interactions just overall.
I think that's great. I'll just also add to that. Like, I think where we see examples of that now, potentially, I've always been a fan of Reddit, because in some ways you could say that their terms of service has been shared with the subreddits. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but the idea that like there obviously is a Reddit terms of service, but what if you decentralize the terms of service? And so you'll see like, you know, the moderators will make certain rules, and like, you know, you may be able to say one thing in a certain Reddit, but you go to another Reddit, you say the same thing, you'll get kicked out. And I think that kind of like governance keeps, it seems more democratic at the end of the day. But I don't know, Michael, what do you think about that? Or
yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting on this something. I think another one is this idea of democracies and public engagement, and there's this like sort of like people agreeing on rule of law collectively. And right now we don't have much of that. It's very authoritarian, and maybe that works well for some social networks. But I think, you know, as things grow, it'll be more opt-in. And so maybe if we want to come up with a constitution together, we can come up with it, elect some leaders to be part of it, and then have those people manage enforcement. But I think that will probably be something.
Is that something that you work on in your work at all? I mean,
yeah. So like this is all about CurateDao. It's like around in my research or
take it wherever you take it wherever.
Like,
I'm just kind of curious.
These are ideas we've sort of brought into CurateDao around like coming up with narrow terms of service and allowing for community adjudication in which types of content should or shouldn't be included in the database. So we have this new type of staking mechanism that allows people to basically ante how much they predict a certain piece of data will or won't be included in the database. So to give an example, it's like, say we have a database of restaurants in New York City, and Chris submits a restaurant that is in New York City. No one's going to stake against that piece of data because it's obviously in New York City. But now say Chris submits a piece of data, and along with this, he's submitting the piece of data, you have to submit $1 along with it. We have a small amount of money that you have to submit. And now say someone comes along and submits a piece of data that is a restaurant in Oregon. I come along and say, that isn't a restaurant that's in Oregon. I'm going to stake $2 against that. And someone else can say, no, that restaurant actually is or isn't. I'm going to stake $4 for it. And it keeps going back and forth in this like double or nothing thing until it reaches a threshold. So if no one takes the other side of it, when it reaches it starts out as Chris submitting a restaurant that's in Oregon for $1, someone pushing it out for $2, someone pushing it back in for $4. And if it stays stuck in this position, then it automatically gets included or excluded. And the money that was staked on the losing team side goes to the winning team. Now, at some point, you don't want to leave it totally up to the crowd. So it goes to the curator who decides if it should or shouldn't be included. And then that person is in charge of delegating the money from the losing team to the winning team.
All right, 2 questions. That's really cool. I'm curious, what's the incentive to pay $1 at the beginning? And then is there, and I'm sure you've thought of this, but like, isn't there some kind of perverse incentives to like whoever has the most money can like write history or like can write the database? So how do you deal with those two?
The first one is if you submit it and your data is accepted. So if you submit it and your $1 and your data is accepted, you get your $1 back. And then you get access. Then also you get but you still like, what's the reason for like even leveraging $1? Yeah. And if it's accepted, as the database monetizes, you're a pro rata owner of the database. And as it monetizes, you get pro rata revenue based on your contributions to the database.
How does it monetize, if you don't mind?
With ad sales, subscription fees, product, whatever.
So essentially, it's still the utilization of the data set.
And then to answer your second question is the curator of the database has a score that we calculate, but also other people could put their own calculation on it. And that prevents, that disincentivizes the curator from defecting and to start accepting all the requests from their friends or anything like that. So we have like a mechanism in place to say like, okay, this is what is going, this curator is honest or this curator is corrupt.
Cool. Does it work? Have you been, I guess sounds like you've been...
Yeah, it works. CurateDao.xyz.
Okay.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
I can go to the site and try it?
Yeah, you should try. Let's bring us back to the question before a bit. but we definitely gonna have time for both of you to talk about your product. Oh, I actually have a question because both of you agree that the new ways of whatever we call social media or social network in the future will be narrow, right? And then the groups or the communities will also be smaller. And because all the services or all the products we are creating for those users, this will lead to an even more modularized communities in the future. But does that actually create a barrier, or does it lead to like more, I don't want to call it segregation, but it's actually, when people, they identify or they know what they like, what kind of content they enjoy, they join this specific community. And because of those product or services, they become more and more into that area, right? And they kind of are excluded from other information, like what Chris or Michael, you said. They get kicked out when they post other information from other groups. How do you view that potential problem?
I mean, you can always join a new network. It's just by default, all information isn't shared all over the place. But maybe there's like to get accepted into a social network, you have to take some test. And once you're qualified, once you've demonstrated that you have some ability you've read the book, say it's a book club. So you just like answer like 3 or 4 questions to make sure that you've read the book and that you're engaging with that, you know the material, and then you get accepted. But I think you bring up an interesting point also. You don't want to have like the haves have more and then for everyone else to get left behind. So what prevents one network from just sort of going off and floating off into a distance? And that would be bad. And we probably need to like make sure that that doesn't happen. But one thing that's nice about it, though, is at least by quantifying what is allowed and what is not allowed, you know what the barrier is or what's available or what's not available. And I feel like today these types of networks exist, but you don't even know. And like the bar that someone has to meet to get in it is either corrupt or not well defined. But at least by having some measure of what is the protocol or what is the way to get accepted into this thing, it's laid out explicitly. So then if it's a bad bar that has to be achieved, that can be dealt with in one way, or I think it will actually help things in the long term.
Yeah, that is very true. I think the blockchain, one important perspective is definitely the transparency, and because the industry is striving for decentralized and the transparency for everything. So it kind of urged all the founders or creators to always follow the rules. And I think this is generally like better for the society or the community overall. At least we are
definitely
going towards that direction.
Yeah, it's like it kind of relates to like the legal system in America. Like the reason that separated the American legal system initially was like all the rules were written down. So that made it so that in theory the way in which someone was determined guilty or not was sort of like well understood versus it just being in sort of the will of the king or whoever's deciding it. When you write down the rules and you have like a clearer rubric for which you determine when things should be on one side or the other side, it probably helps things.
I didn't know that. Is that true? Like before the
Constitution? Yeah, I mean, writing down the laws was like, or maybe like what made things more explicit. Maybe it was Hammurabi. Or,
I was going to say Hammurabi's.
Maybe, but I think each iteration of written law has sort of tried to be more expository and explicit in how things are determined.
Interesting. Now, I would like to talk a little bit about the product you are building. But before we dig into that, let's address the different types of social media first. I know, Chris, you don't like the word social media, but we gotta refer to it right now.
Nah, that's cool.
So based on my research, there are generally 5 types of social media: social networking, photo sharing, video sharing, interactive media, and blogging or community building. So what type of social media actually do you guys use most frequently?
Sure, yeah. I like Twitter. I'm at Castig on Twitter if you want to follow me. And I guess Mike give a shout out to. I actually just followed you, Mike. What's your Twitter again?
Oh, 0x Mike.
0x, yeah. I just followed you. Yeah, I feel like that's a great place to kind of get like a sense of like what people are thinking, and like you can usually, it's like a sense of identity. You could like read about things I've written and all that stuff. So I like Twitter. I think Jack Dorsey said Twitter is the closest thing we have to global consciousness, and I think there's like some shred of truth to that. At any moment, you get a sense of what's happening in the world. And then I would say that's like it. I don't know. I actually have I have an old iPhone that I keep all my social media apps on. Like I have TikTok and Instagram and like all the things, but I keep it all on that. And then when I leave the house, I never take it with me because I am addicted and I will check it a million times and I don't want to be doing that. So I think to me, I've just been trying to have a moat, have some space between, how I consume social media. So when I'm on the go, I don't do it. But when I'm back at home, I'll check Twitter and talk to people on there. What about you?
Yeah, I love Twitter. Like Chris said, I think Twitter is great for like learning things. And then just so that to have something different, I would say TikTok, because I think that they're really pushing the boundary on the transition from human-generated content to sort of AI-generated content. So like right now, your social graph determines the types of content that you would see on Twitter.
Yes.
Whereas on primarily on TikTok, your social graph isn't as important. And it's more based around bots and AI determining what you'll see or what's created. And that's probably going to be another transition in like Web3 is being more like AI friendly. So instead of all content being produced by humans, I could easily see a way in which bots or like something like DALL-E on steroids just knows what either your optimization algorithm is within your brain or the optimization algorithm of Twitter or TikTok, and producing content that exactly fits that. And that could be like an interesting thing also. But I'd say TikTok is pretty fun and Twitter for learning stuff. I have another one is Strava. So like I really like Strava because it encourages it encourages you to run and get feedback from other people and learn about like new like routes that are in your area and like try and like get you to get a better mile time or stuff like that. So it's encouraging like behavior that you might want and keeping track of it.
And what type of product are you guys trying to build out of the 5 categories?
I'll let Chris.
Yes.
Do you want to go first? I mean, so yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we're trying to build a product that is basically like a database for new types of Web3 applications, where a database that, so I'll give an example of one we're building on top of it as the example, and then I'll tell you how it relates to the database that we're building.
Is this CurateDao?
Yeah, so this is CurateDao. That was the question, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're building like Pinterest on the blockchain. So what that means is you come along and you say like, oh, I want to create a board around like academic papers or things that I like. Let's say academic papers. So I say like, I'm really interested in natural language processing. I want to create a board of papers that are about natural language processing and program synthesis. And I pin like 5 things on my board. Now let's say Chris comes along and he says, I want to add this one to your board. And so Chris comes along and he adds a paper that says, I think you'll like this one. I think also the people that follow you on Twitter will also like this one. And it's not included in your board now. And then he posts it on my board and I say, that's a great thing. I'm going to accept it. Chris gets his $1 back. So when Chris submitted the paper on NLP, he had to stake $1 that was going to be accepted on my board. When it was, he gets his $1 back. Now let's say Chris submits another paper or something, and it's not as good. It's like around like image generation. And Meina, you come along and you say, oh, that was bad. I'm going to vote $2 that it was bad. And then I'm going to say, actually, you were right. I'm going to give you that $1 that Chris submitted when he submitted it. He's going to lose that $1, and you're going to get your $2 plus the $1 that he submitted. So you're going to get $3 back. And then basically, like as the board monetizes, as some people view this curated set of natural language papers, we sell advertisements along the side of it, or people pay a subscription fee. And that partially goes to me, and that partially goes to Chris, who submitted the paper. Now, if we kind of so we're building this like Pinterest, but like longer term, we're opening up this like data structure that we've created to allow people to build Instagram or decentralized Twitter or decentralized Facebook on top of it, and allow the people who submit the content and the people who curate content in these like very niche curated data sets to be able to monetize these live active data sets. And you can find out more about it at CurateDao.xyz.
Yeah. I will include the link in the description for the video. Chris, do you want to talk a bit about Console.xyz?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for sharing that, Michael. That's awesome.
Thanks.
So I've built Console. It's Console.xyz. You can find out everything there. It's an alternative to Discord. So it's a chat app that you can use. Right now we're in beta with a few communities. They're using it. And one of the real big breakthroughs right now is that you use your decentralized identity, your NFT, your .eth name, your .btc, whatever it is, to join the communities. So we can have communities that are secured on the blockchain. And then from there, just pull in all the data that would supercharge this community so that 2 people talking can use open source data that's on the blockchain, such as like coding from Snapshot or multi-sig safe at Gnosis. How do we pull all that data together to bring more kind of like transparency and openness to the people who are in our community? And how do we make chat more secure? I put out a piece this week about Discord hacks. Discord hacks have cost Web3 communities literally over $1 billion. And we hired a cybersecurity firm because we were curious to investigate and basically do research on over 100 Discord hacks and basically distill it into advice that we could use to help build Console better, but also to share with the world on what we found. And the kind of TLDR is identity hacks are the start of nearly every Discord hack, because you need to hack somebody's identity in order to basically have a fraud phishing link, which is the majority of the hacks. And anyway, yeah, you can follow me on Twitter or just follow up. I'm at Castig, like I said, or at our blog at Console.xyz. There's so many things that I want to share with people, and I don't want to talk about it for 15 minutes, but yeah, I would love people to check it out and write me and let me know. I think it could be really valuable. So that's what we're working on, and yeah, a lot more great updates over the next few months as we continue to roll it out to more communities.
So Chris, you talked about a little bit around Sybil attacks and people impersonating another person's identity as the core. And I was wondering, how does owning your identity prevent someone from saying you've never met me, but I'm the founder of XYZ and I wanted to pitch you on my NFT or whatever? Can you talk a little bit how Web3 prevents the Sybil attacks that might be seen on Discord anyway?
That's a great question. So we have this kind of pattern in our day-to-day lives already of how we use identity to make the internet more secure, and it's called domains, right? And so if I'm going to Instagram, we know to look at the URL and say is it Instagram.com or is it Instagram, 3 M's or something like that. And we have these protections, and it's because only one person can own Instagram that we can trust. Okay, this is a trusted relationship. And so, Michael, if you and I are using our .eth names, for example, or any other kind of decentralized identity, because an NFT or a decentralized identity could only be owned by one person, when we're interacting, assuming we have some semblance of trust to start with, then we can continue from there and feel distrust. So that's the basic part of it, but there's a lot more, right? Because when we look in terms of Discord specifically, it's very centralized with how they handle their authentication. You have to have, in order to use Discord, you have to have an email and a password, right? It's pretty Web2. So you get on with your email and your password, and then in order to authenticate, the way they do it is with bots. So you've probably had this experience. You join a Web3 community on Discord, you read all these steps, you go to a bunch of other sites, it connects your wallet, it does all this kind of magic that most people don't know what it's doing, but they just press accept, accept, accept. And it's a lot of times either in that process or later down the line, surprisingly, the bots will be hacked. You'll see it's an employee at Great Protocol. This is the case, Great Protocol in Solana, an employee there, their email was hacked, and then the bot got hacked, and then all the communities get hacked. Or you see something with Me6. And Me6, the code didn't, I believe it, I'm doing this legally, don't want to quote me on this, but it was something read my post for more, but it was something I think the code was just not up to date or something like that. There was a problem with the code, right? And because the code is up to date, basically credentials got compromised, and then from the bot, it goes out. So there's a lot of points of vulnerability when you start using all these bots, and Discord has all these places that could be hacked. If you bring all of that in and it's just Console and the blockchain, well, so far, the big blockchains, Bitcoin and Ethereum and a bunch of the big ones have not been hacked. So very secure there. So you're inheriting that security. And then at least there's just one point of failure, which is Console. And we're really working our best. That's where making it more secure through open source, through doing audits, through decentralizing as much as possible, so that there's less. If we don't have ownership of the central hub of it, there's less to hack. And so that's eventually where we aim to get, and that's what we're working towards.
Then my next question for you guys would be, I guess we kind of addressed it a bit, but I want to talk in more details. Is there going to be a new type of social media in the future that's specifically created for the Web3 users? And if there will be, what type of, or what kind would you envision that to be?
I think the thing, I'll just kind of somewhat repeat, but I think the thing I'm excited about are, there's a lot of problems in the world which are worthy of our attention. There's a lot of interesting questions in the world which are worthy of people, whether it's academics or whoever working on. There's a lot of creative people in the world who have a lot of creative skills. And would love to find meaning through contributing their work. The thing that's tricky is there's a lot of barriers for, the world isn't meritocratic. Like the amount of work or how good your work is doesn't always guarantee that you're going to connect with the people and get valued for your work. So I think the web in general has obviously lifted that democratic creation and connection through Reddit, through Facebook, through whatever. But I think there's this whole other kind of vision of where it could go, where we're seeing it already, where it's like NFT music, where it's like you can own and share music, and the people that listen to it first can have some ownership or stake in it or some kind of ownership in it. So I think that like when we talk about the future of like social media, social networks, I think it'll become more localized and more niche around like music collection, around organizing to like, whether it's like fix a pothole in your town, or whether it's like get somebody to fundraise as like a senator or I don't know, just to like throw a pizza party. I don't know. I think that there's like a lot of interesting ways to coordinate and like communicate with people that won't just be like just content based. I think it'll go beyond content and into like our actual lives more. It's my best guess.
One thing that might be, I don't think that we're gonna have like a Twitter on the blockchain is be like the runaway hit for crypto social media. One thing that could be interesting is like if we look at social media today as being like small 140 character things, we could have like bigger projects. So one of the things that crypto, like Wikipedia style things. So one of the things that crypto is really good at is figuring out like the coordination problem, because like protocols have well-defined like coordination mechanisms for people to engage with and for people to be incentivized with. So maybe we'll see like bigger projects, like a new Wikipedia, or people making an entire film, or like basically like instead of it being one person contributing many things, maybe we'll have many people contributing to one giant thing, whether that be an in-person project, like building a like art project, or building there's this new concept by Balaji around the network state. So maybe there'll be multiple people contributing into a country, or sort of just like, it's just like multiple people coordinating on one thing, as opposed to, or of course, then like there's the digital thing. It's like the Wikipedia. That's sort of the transition. That should be from like IRL to like digital. And so we'll see many people contributing to one thing, or maybe it'll be like curated sets. So you have multiple people contributing to a curated database, and it's not just one person who has control of it.
I think both of you guys have brought up very, very good point. And you also talk about people contributing to one thing, or one person contributing to different thing. That's all lead to the point that the social media or social network will not only influence the social part of people's life, but also like functional part, your daily lives, your job, not only the entertainment part, your education, and even more.
Yeah. So like education could be like one of those things that is like the blowaway hit for social media, in the sense that like people are incentivized to learn. Maybe there's like a company that's paying someone to learn around, maybe it's like SpaceX needs someone who's like an expert welder, and like welding just isn't taught anymore in schools, or they need someone who knows like a very specific propulsion thing, and like that's just not taught. So they pay people to learn that mechanism, then they can hire those people. But I think education and social networks could be like one of those like probably things that if it works, it would be huge.
Yeah. Chris, do you have anything you want to add on to that point?
No, I mean, I guess the thing that I take away from all this is like anyone listening, to me, Web3 is going to be bigger than whatever we're calling Web3 right now. Probably won't even use that phrase in a few years. So this is like really early days. And
Web5. I
think, yeah.
I'm just joking.
Yeah. So I think there's like a great opportunity to just get involved, and whether that's like learning to code or learning to whatever skill, like design, manage, make music. I think there's like so many opportunities. We just need like curious people, because it goes well beyond NFTs or this kind of where we're at right now. We're in like day zero, and I think that there's like a lot of opportunity. If you start right now, in even 5 years, you're going to be like an expert for sure.
I agree. And this actually leads to my next question. I originally want to ask you guys, like, what do you guys think social media will empower from an educational perspective? But I think we kind of touched on that already, right?
Yeah. Basically, people will be like more cooperative, more competitive, and they'll be like instead of like getting likes on a post, you'll get like kudos on an essay, and I think that's really great because like right now when you write an essay, you're basically optimizing for the teacher, but the teacher as a adjudicator in quality isn't always the best. Like what the teacher finds interesting doesn't mean that someone wrote an essay that isn't interesting. It just means that that person didn't find it interesting. But it might be like really, really well received by the global community or the person that isn't your teacher. So I think it'll lead to like a much more interesting, like, it's not so much that like there are bad essays, of course, but they're also just essays that didn't hit the optimization of the person that was grading it. And I think that'll help. I mean, one of the outcomes of that is you have a lot of like groupthink within an educational system where that you're optimizing for a teacher, but the teacher just like is only one perspective on what is society at large.
Yeah, all that, it's great.
Yeah, it is, but it sounds like it's also a decentralization of the authority, like how we define authority or how we define what is good, what is bad.
Yeah, but I think that's fair. Like there are many judgments of what is good. I mean, there are some things that are probably objectively bad, and like you don't want that. But I think there's a lot more things where there just wasn't the right fit for a piece of content that right now is be great. It would be thought of as bad, but that doesn't really need to be the case.
I can tell from all our expressions, this all leads to very deep philosophical questions or thinking, like our conversation today, and I'm really enjoying it so far. But also, it makes me start to doubt a lot of perspectives.
Basically, I'll be at the Waldorf School online or something. It'll all be self-exploration.
And before I wrap up the podcast, every single guest need to share a fun fact about yourself. Who wants to go first?
I will share one. Okay, so as we're growing CurateDao, it's become easier. I still enjoy programming, so I think that's a fun fact. I think like as things grow, it oftentimes people don't remain as engaged, but I still enjoy programming, so I still like to do it as part of growing the product. Even though like it's become less and less important, the fun fact is that I enjoy it.
Oh, very cool. Thank you for sharing. What about you, Chris?
Cool. I don't know what to share, but I don't know. I like to play music a lot still. So I play piano and guitar as much as I can. I don't know. Just it's nice.
When people say they play some kind of instruments or they can do some dance, the next part is we need a clip for that and to include in the next podcast. But just for the next podcast, so that you have time to prepare for that.
Okay, no problem.
Anyways, thank you guys for joining the podcast today. I'm really looking forward to more fun conversations like this. And let's say goodbye to our audience. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.